with the Oregonian. oh, I'm Andrew Theen, a reporter at the Oregonian, and I am a host of the Beat Check with the Oregonian podcast. And I'm here with Zachary Stocks, the executive director of the Oregon Black Pioneers. Zachary, thanks so much for taking time to talk today.
Thanks, Andrew. It's cool to be here.
It's great to have you. So, last summer, you were named the first executive director of Oregon Black Pioneers, which is an organization that's been around for a long time. People may or may not have heard of. But, we tend to in this state have a, if not historically accurate impression, at least of the early days of the Oregon Trail and people who were white and first settled here, who settled. I mean, what do we know about the Oregon Black Pioneers?
Well, we know a good amount, and really that is because of some really intensive research that's been done by my organization long before I got here. As you mentioned, Oregon Black Pioneers, we were founded in 1993, and it was really around answering that question, right? Like, what were the experiences of the people of African descent that participated in the largest mass migration, voluntary mass migration of people in American history, which is the Oregon Trail, right? So the peopling of non-Indigenous people in Oregon, we know that Blacks were among them, but we lack a lot of information about their actual lived experiences. And so our organization was founded to try and figure out what is the history there? Where did they live? What were their lives like? What kind of businesses did they create? What kind of opportunities were there for their families? And then trying to present as much of that information as possible to the public in various capacities, whether that's historical markers, whether that's public presentations, or of course, in-person exhibitions.
And you have a very specialized and unique history that kind of tailors really well to this organization and its mission. Can you give a brief background of kind of what led you to this organization and what your expertise is?
Yeah, it was pretty serendipitous. So I started back in June, and I had just been laid off from a private exhibit design firm that I had only been working for about 6 months. Mm-hmm. But I've been working in and around museums for 10 years now. And really that was born out of, I grew up in Virginia. I had a passion for going to a lot of museums, history museums in particular, and especially living history museums. And I got really into the costume interpretation thing, and I wanted to pursue that as a career. Yeah. So I went to William & Mary for college, which is, as you probably know, is right on the campus of Colonial Williamsburg. Yeah. And so I got my first museum gig as an intern there for a year, did costume interpretation. And then after getting my degree in public history, decided I wanted to professionalize this work. So I moved to Seattle, went to the University of Washington and got a master's degree in museum studies and got my first paying museum job at the Northwest African American Museum. So that's where I started to learn the histories of Blacks in the Pacific Northwest, because I'm not from here. I wasn't, I didn't know anything about the experiences of Blacks in Washington and Oregon. But I learned a ton working at that museum, and I stayed there for 4 years. And afterwards, I went on to an organization called Historical Seaport, which is a Washington state nonprofit that manages the state ships. And they interpret maritime heritage of the 18th and 19th century. So some of those stories include people of color as well, including people of African descent. And so it really was pretty interesting that I had suddenly, without even really trying to, built up a lot of expertise in the history of Black people in the Pacific Northwest in the 18th and 19th century. So when the opportunity came up at Oregon Black Pioneers, I really thought, well, shoot, I can't pass this up. I have to apply, right? So I was really grateful.
And we should note that you live out in Astoria, which is, in terms of a historic town, a settlement in Oregon. I mean, it's obviously nationally famous, internationally famous as well.
For sure. Oldest town west of the Mississippi.
Well, let's dive into some specific, maybe lesser known Oregonians or events that occurred here in Oregon that you and your organization are trying to raise more awareness about. So maybe let's start with a name that we talked about when we previously spoke. Who was Alonzo Tucker?
Yes. So Alonzo Tucker was a Californian who was living in Marshfield, which is today Coos Bay. in 1902 when he became the only known Black person in Oregon to be lynched. He was a boxer and he owned a gym in Marshfield. And he allegedly assaulted a white woman in 1902, as I said. And he was jailed and managed to escape when he learned that there was a mob coming for him. And he hid out overnight, but the next morning he was found, and then he was shot and hanged over a bridge that stood where the high school is now. And so our organization is working with a number of groups to try and maintain that story and also create opportunities for healing with some sort of a new public memorial to recognize the fact that this is the only documented Black lynching in Oregon, but it's part of a national story of extrajudicial killings of Black people by white mobs.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that obviously carried on for decades beyond Alonzo Tucker's murder. That's something that's part of America's DNA, sadly.
For sure. And so this is the only entry from Oregon that is part of a national effort to document these sites, spearheaded by the Equal Justice Initiative. And the work to do that here in Oregon has been headed up by Taylor Stewart, who created an organization of his own called the Oregon Remembrance Project. And so we've got a nice task force of folks, mostly representing Coos Bay in that community, but also folks from around the state who are committed to learning from this atrocity and remembering the story of Alonzo Tucker, so that we don't make these stories again. We don't make these mistakes again.
Right. Well, thank you for raising that awareness and talking about his story here today. Let's move on to a different piece of Black history here in Oregon. What was Beaver Hill, and why is that a historically relevant place that Oregonians should know about?
Yeah, so I love the story of Beaver Hill, and it's a story that I don't come across many people who've heard of it before, but actually not too far from Coos Bay. This is between Coquille and Marshfield, is where there was once a coal mining community called Beaver Hill, and it was founded as a railroad town, or founded by the Southern Pacific Railroad to take advantage of large deposits of coal. This region is the only part of Oregon that really had coal. And so it was founded in 1894. And in 1895, the operator of this mine needed to get experienced miners. So he sent a representative to West Virginia to recruit miners to take them all the way to Oregon. And so 17 Blacks came out as part of that recruitment effort. And they were promised upon arrival, they would receive $5 a day in pay and have good housing. They took a steamship to San Francisco and then traveled overland to Roseburg and then walked the rest of the way. And when they got to Beaver Hill, they found out that there was no housing waiting for them, and their pay would only be 90 cents a day. So that was in January of 1895. And we know that by March, there was at least 70 Blacks living at Beaver Hill. And by November, a strike had taken place. And when the Black workers complained about their poor wages, their poor living conditions, they were fired en masse, and they walked back to Marshfield, where there was a collection started for them by the community's Chinese residents, and then they got passage back home.
During that period, Zachary, I mean, how significant of a share do we know? How significant of a share of Oregon's population that would be? That 70 plus Black men who were working in the mine.
It would have been highly unusual, for sure. I mean, this is at a time when there were probably less than 1,000 Blacks in all of Oregon, and to think that at its peak, when with Black employment, there were possibly over 100 people there, because that was 70 workers, but many of them had families as well. They they came with their wives, they had children. So the Black population, we have one account of a man who was traveling through the area from Roseburg, and he reported going to a concert in the park and seeing what he estimated to be 200 Black people there. So Beaver Hill, silently and for only a short amount of time, may have been one of, if not the largest population center of Blacks in Oregon. Again, even if only for a year or two.
So, what remains of Beaver Hill today?
Nothing. But we're working to put a marker there on the actual Beaver Slough. We've been working with the Oregon Travel Information Council, which puts up the state highway markers. And we've got a great group of historians and folks from the local museums, the local tribes, to make sure that we can tell this story. Because it wasn't just Blacks living there, it was also immigrants from throughout Europe. There were Chinese, Filipino, Japanese workers there too, Mexicans. So this was a really diverse place at a time. I mean, even today, you think about Oregon, and it really doesn't reflect that racial diversity. But I have to remind people all the time that at different points in our history, Oregon was a very diverse place, depending on where you were. But we don't see manifestations of that now because of policy and because of racism, like what happened to the Black miners who came in and were dismissed after the bait and switch with their wages.
I'm glad you mentioned that we don't know a lot about this history, because I think for a lot of Oregonians, no matter if they are people of color or white Oregonians or what have you, what they know about Oregon's history with Black folks is maybe the exclusionary law, that Blacks were basically outlawed from the beginning of our state's founding, and then the Vanport flood and its dramatic impacts to the Black population and what was the second largest city in the state at the time.
That's right.
In Oregon. But so why are these other stories and people and places that your organization is trying to highlight, why are those so important?
Well, I think that they're important because the people who were here, I mean, their lives matter. Their stories have dignity. They raised families here. They contributed to the creation of some of Oregon's first permanent communities. And we need to recognize those experiences to the same degree that we talk about, these white historical figures who there's places named after them, and there's museums named after them, and parks named after them. So few of the Black individuals who contributed just as much to their communities, we don't know their names or their stories. So when we at Oregon Black Pioneers get our hands on a lead, we really want to dig into that, because we believe that we'll have a better picture of our state heritage by understanding what were the lived experiences of people of African descent who were here and contributed to the development of these same places.
What challenges do you face, Zachary, and do historians face piecing together this early history of Black pioneers in our state?
Well, I guess the hardest part is that everything is very scattered, right? Before our organization came around, there really wasn't a single repository for keeping all of this information. And so because of that, what is out there hasn't really been maintained to the degree that historical societies for more than a century have been maintaining local histories about white Oregonians. And the other challenge is that history is written by white people in this state. And so how often they write about Black people really determines what stories we have to tell, because we have almost no surviving accounts of the experiences of Black Oregonians in their own hands. They all come from other people. And so we have to take the leads that we get and try to extrapolate as much information as we can when the people who are actually giving us this information are using derogatory language, or they may only make referential comments about the Blacks in their life, who may have been their domestic servants. They may have been their slaves, frankly, because Oregon is a place where there were slaves, and we don't talk about that very much either.
Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more, because I know there's been a reckoning of sorts in some quarters in recent years when you think of the renaming. I hesitate to say controversies, but the events going down at University of Oregon or in Oregon State are really around the nation. People who are either proponents of slavery or in some cases held slaves of their own. What do we know about slavery's existence in Oregon?
Right. So we know of at least 40 named enslaved blacks who were brought to Oregon between 1843 and 1860. And so if anyone thinks that there's never been slaves in Oregon, that's just not true. We know that there were enslaved blacks here. And while Oregon on paper outlawed slavery as early as 1843 in the Organic Acts, nonetheless, in the 1844 Black Exclusion Law, the first one that you mentioned before, it explicitly gave anyone who brought enslaved blacks to Oregon up to 3 years before they had to legally emancipate them. So while slavery was outlawed on paper, it was nonetheless allowed to exist here for years at a time. And many people often ignored that. And we know of certain individuals who were held as slaves far beyond that 3-year window when they were legally entitled, but their slave owners were legally entitled to keep these people.
How many of the people who arrived in Oregon via the Oregon Trail were Black?
I've heard numbers like, excuse me, like only about 3% of the blacks, of the people who took part of the Oregon Trail were Black, but not all of them went to Oregon. You know, many of them, the Blacks settled in Colorado, many went to California. So the number of Blacks who actually came to Oregon via the Oregon Trail was really slim, not a large number at all. So it's all the more telling that when Oregon started to pass its laws explicitly banning free Blacks from settlement in Oregon, they did so at a time when the Black population here was never more than 1% at all. So why would they devote so much time and attention to taking steps to keep out a population that had never, at one point or another threatened the stability or the control of the legislature or anything like that? And it really is white supremacy because they wanted to create a place where there would be no Blacks. They believed in the absence of Blacks, they could become a more prosperous agricultural and economic place.
Let's go back to some of the places and people we were talking about earlier. So this is kind of from my neck of the woods where I grew up, Jacksonville in Southern Oregon. How is Jacksonville relevant to the state's Black history?
Jacksonville has a big part to play in the history of early Blacks in Oregon. It actually, Southern Oregon, before the development of Portland as the hub of Black Oregon, that really began with the railroad's arrival in the 1880s. Prior to that, the closest thing you might call a Black community in Oregon would have been in Southern Oregon, and Jacksonville was a big part of that. And again, the story of Blacks in Southern Oregon is a story of interconnectedness of different communities of color, because the Blacks lived among the Hawaiians and they lived among the Chinese, and so these were very diverse places. And we don't see that represented there as well. But they came primarily to work in mining, as gold mining, and then coal mining as well. But there were people among them who did really well for themselves, like Ben Johnson, who our organization helped to have a mountain that had been known for decades as Negro Ben Mountain get renamed Ben Johnson Mountain after his actual name was rediscovered. One of our board members worked very closely with the Geographic Names Board to commemorate that and have it officially changed. And now it's one of the few place names in Oregon named for a Black person, a known Black person.
All right, I want to put you on the spot with just some random, tell us about a specific part of the state trivia. I know you like trivia too, so
I do like trivia.
We'll see what you can do here. So Zachary, what can you tell us about a specific story that we might not know about in like Eastern Oregon?
So there were Blacks in Eastern Oregon during the pioneering days. There was a family, the Sewell family lived out in Canyon City near John Day. Columbus Sewell came for the gold rush in 1862 with his wife Louisa and their young son Thomas Sewell. And they built a home in Canyon City. And he, like many people, recognized that it's easier to make money outfitting and supplying people who are looking for gold rather than looking for gold yourself. So he started a freight business, and he used it to transport goods between John Day and the Dalles. And so he did that for many years. Louisa apparently was known locally for making ice cream and playing croquet on their yard. So they were very much a part of the community. And then more recent in history, compared to them in the 1860s, we have folks like the Anderson family. There were two brothers who in the 1910s, Oscar and Walter Anderson, moved out north and south of Burns to start ranches. And then their Walter's wife, Martha, moved with them as well.
Okay, so we've talked about Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon, some of the coastal communities. I don't know. What about the Eugene Springfield area? Any stories leap to mind of the history of Black pioneers in kind of the lower valley there?
Sure. So, I mean, the lower valley, we have folks who lived in near Roseburg, like William Eads, and Myrtle Creek was the landing spot of Letitia Carson when she became the first Black woman to successfully file a land claim under the Homestead Act. She settled near there. And again, moving out of the pioneering era and into the modern era, Eugene, of course, the University of Oregon was a hotspot for student activism during the Civil Rights Movement. And we have an exhibition that talks about that right now, which is up at the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History.
Okay, so people should, if they're able to, I don't know if the museum is operating COVID safety wise, but go check that out if you're down there. Zachary, I'm just curious. We're in this era of, in the last year. I mean, our conversation right now is starting the day of the first day of the trial of Derek Chauvin. I'm probably butchering his name. The police officer involved who had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes or whatever last year, and this nation has been in this renewed moment since then. What do you make of this as a historian and as a Black man in America living through the last year?
I mean, I would just say this is an example of how, history is always happening around us. Sometimes we don't really understand it until we're past it. But what's the old saying? How's it go? The more things change, the more they stay the same. Yeah. We've seen these things before. I was looking at a photograph the other day of Black women marching down the streets in Portland holding signs that said ban the chokehold and stop police killing. But it wasn't about George Floyd. It was about Lloyd Stevenson back in the 1980s. I mean, we've seen these things before here in Oregon, and they still are happening. And it's just, I wish I could say it's been a wake-up call, but we seem to live in a culture that perpetuates violence against Black people, so often unarmed, without any cause, and it's disgraceful as far as I'm concerned. So I just hope that by telling the truth about these things, we can do our part as a historical society, just like every organization has a role to play in working to dismantle white supremacy. Ours is by trying to present information about the past so that people can recognize how far we've come and also how far we have not come.
I'm curious if you followed the kind of a gorilla statue going up. It's the opposite of a statue coming down in Mount Tabor Park of York, who's obviously a person that I think a lot of Oregonians and Americans know. But I mean, what did you make of that moment?
I love it. I thought it was great. I shared it all over my own social media. I think that, I don't want to see markers or historical monuments to slave owners or to people that, didn't believe in the value of, Black life, the life of other people of color. It's nice to see a testament to someone who suffered those indignities, but also contributed greatly to what is our nation, what are the best things about our nation today. So I was really amazed to see that bust of York go up. And I fully endorse, what else, any other sorts of hit and run art and history activities that take place. That's just my opinion, but I think it's great. Yeah.
I mean, what do you have any York facts? Anything about York that you would want to say to people listening or watching?
Yeah. So, I mean, that one's pretty personal to me because I'm actually a seasonal ranger at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park here in Astoria. And so we talk about York on a regular basis. York was born in Caroline County, Virginia. I have lived in Caroline County, Virginia, but I had never even heard of York until I moved to Washington State. And it's ridiculous to think that someone who lived less than an hour from where I once lived, that I would have no information about their life and their story until I was thousands of miles from home. So I really appreciate that York's contributions to one of the most tremendous and impactful historical moments in the 19th or the 18th century in American history. No, it was the 19th century. That it's finally being told.
And that of course is the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Yes.
That York was participated in. What do we know about his participation?
Well, he had a lot of freedoms during the actual journey that he would not have had when he was still living in Kentucky, which is where he departed from with William Clark, who owned him legally.
Right.
So he carried a gun, he hunted, he did some scouting along with other members of the expedition. He slept and celebrated amongst all the other members of the Corps of Discovery. There's really touching moments when you see York in the Lewis and Clark journals. He is playing with Blackfoot children when they're up on the northern plains, and he was sort of a spectacle for a lot of the tribes who had never seen black man before. So I think that in those that 3.5 year period that York was a part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, were probably the most significant moments of his life, not because of the historical significance of what he was doing, but because of the amounts of freedoms that he had that he never had before and never had afterwards, because his experiences after returning home were quite tragic.
Yeah, and your story, Zachary, that you mentioned, you had to come out west to learn his story. That kind of says a lot about how we capture and who gets to write these stories that are so consequential to so many people.
Absolutely.
So how can people get involved in Oregon Black Pioneers or in learning more about our state's Black history generally?
Sure. Well, I would always direct someone to visit our website. It is just OregonBlackPioneers.org. Also, if you can, see some of our exhibitions. I mentioned the one that's at the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History. Please do check all of these to make sure places are open, though. But that one is called Racing to Change, Oregon's Civil Rights Years, the Eugene Story. And then we have another exhibition that's up in Philomath right now called Black in Oregon, 1840 to 1870 at the Benton County History Museum, which is about profiles of some of the Black individuals who came during the peak Oregon Trail years and then just before and just after. And then the last one is, it's called All Aboard, Railroading in Oregon's Black Community. And that's at the Oregon Rail Heritage Center in Portland. It's on display right now. And I believe that museum is free.
Well, those are three great options for people as they hopefully venture out into the world a little bit more. Thank you so much for taking time to talk about those exhibits and so much more. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks.